Then you look at these AI tools, and particularly for the customer service use case, where it's doing the actual work itself. It is answering customer queries, resolving problems automatically. And so it's not like it's assisting the work of the human, it's doing the work itself. So we started steering very clearly towards an outcome-based model, or very much a value-based model. We considered conversation volume. If you think about a customer support team, the volume of what drives work is the volume of conversations that they have.
That's how BPOs charge, right? The conversation volume.
That sort of puts the incentives at odds between, Intercom and our customers, where, it's in the customer's interest that resolution rate, like the percentage of conversations that are resolved, is higher and higher if they're just paying on conversations. But for Intercom, of course, we spend more for every resolution we deliver.
Plus, you want more resolutions to go to Intercom as opposed to fewer, right? So if you're charging per interaction, then people gonna have to think about that. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Get Paid podcast with me, your host, Manny Medina. A few months back, I sat down with Dan Griggs, the CFO of Intercom, and we talked about one of the boldest bets in SaaS. They blew up their own pricing model and comp structure to set themselves up for the future. And guess what they did just a couple weeks back? They rebranded the whole company to Fin, their agent, and it's now the agent company. That's incredible. Those are two of the boldest moves I've ever seen. Since that news, I wanted to put this episode back out as the conversation provides a whole lot of context to what happened in the past when they moved from seats to outcomes, and what is happening right now as they're moving from Intercom to Fin, and what they did it before, and even what happened and why. It's a great listen. I hope you enjoy it, and we'll be back next week with another episode. And in the meantime, subscribe, and enjoy this conversation with Dan Griggs, CFO of Intercom. And as always, let's get paid. Dan, so good to have you here. I'm so excited about this conversation. You are my first CFO, proper CFO. And I've been talking about CFO stuff with non-CFOs, but now I finally get to talk to a proper CFO. You can bring that perspective into the fold. So welcome to Get Paid.
Great. Glad to be here. Appreciate you having me on.
Well, so let's start with, who is Dan Griggs? Where do you start? Why CFO? You have so many talents. Why you decide to apply yourself to this thing? Your career history through Rocket Fuel, Sitecore, and now Intercom.
Yeah. Well, look, when I very early started out, I was an electrical engineer. And I think after finishing that degree, pretty quickly decided that this kind of full-time career as an engineer wasn't for me, and went back to school, for business and finance, so forth. Pretty early on, pivoted to finance roles. I started out at really big companies. I was at AT&T in one of those kind of leadership rotation programs for a little while. I worked for Nestlé in their ice cream division, so very far from tech, but being in the Bay Area and, having the engineering background, wanted to get into tech pretty quickly, and was fortunate to find my way to Rocket Fuel, as you mentioned. Just an incredible growth story at the time. It just is the sort of heyday of ad tech. They had some really cool technology and sort of the earlier versions of AI, the applications of AI at the time. And was there from, on the order of 50 million in revenue to north of 400 million through an IPO, and just a unbelievably condensed learning experience. That was all in the span of 3 years.
That's incredible.
So a lot of fun, learned a lot from a lot of really smart people and among the leadership team over there, and just feel fortunate to have had that experience.
And then Sitecore. So tell me about Sitecore.
Yeah,
that's another.
Sitecore was a different animal. Started there in around 2014. A bit of a unique story where, they had been founded in Denmark and sort of licensed the rights to market and sell the software to independent businesses around the world. So there was a Sitecore UK, a Sitecore USA, Sitecore Australia. Very successful way to grow. At least it was for them.
Well, like a franchise?
Yeah, effectively like a franchise model.
So like Mickey D's, but for sites.
But for software in this case, yes. Yeah. Web content management primarily is what they were known for at the time. And some investors had come in prior to my joining to, pick up enough ownership of each of these franchises and the founding entity to bring it under one global, structure. And so when I joined, things were very sort of fragmented around the world. I joined to lead FP&A at the time. And you can imagine for much smaller businesses, the amount of FP&A that they have is relatively limited. So it was a collection of much smaller businesses aggregating to something on the order of 150 million in revenue. So it was really about sort of aggregating all of that, globalizing how we operated, both from a financial perspective. I had a counterpart on the controller side owning that piece, a CRO brought in, a head of marketing brought in to really globalize operations from what was very fragmented, just based on how the company grew up. We sort of got all that done and ended up selling the company to private equity in 2016. With really the investment thesis behind that being primarily the transition from a perpetual license model to subscription and SaaS.
So wait, what year was that?
2016.
So were you guys a little late to the SaaS party, or were you just on time?
Yeah. I mean, the company had grown up perpetual license on-prem. The technology was suited more to on-prem at the time, but certainly they were late to that transition, in my opinion. But a very solid investment thesis, as you can imagine, from a private equity buyer. And so that was the challenge over the next few years. I ended up stepping into the CFO role not long after the transaction and really kind of helping to manage the business through that, perpetual license to subscription and SaaS transformation. And as you can imagine, in a private equity owned business with debt on the business and covenants and so forth to work through, it's a transition that, it impacts revenue, it impacts cash flow, all the things that those transitions impact, a very complex thing to do at the time. So again, just an incredible experience, worked with some great people, learned a lot. And we managed, by the time I left, to have transitioned, I think, like 95% of the revenue from perpetual license to subscription and SaaS. So
that's incredible. So let's stay with this theme for a minute, because it's going to influence the theme of agents we're about to talk about. So, you're not a normal SaaS company, because or a normal software company, because you have this burden of debt. So you had this minimum requirement of cash flow production laid on the business to even work, right? So at that point, your margins and your pricing matter significantly, almost disproportionately than a normal business. So what was the puts and takes that you learn from going from perpetual, which is big fat wad of dollars, to subscription that is now more depending on seats and perhaps more recurrent, if you would, but less of it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That the trade of the big upfront slug of revenue and cash for the smaller recurring number. Obviously the metrics you focus on change a lot. A lot more focus on recurring revenue, retention rates, net retention, gross retention. But as you said, the pace at which you go through that transition can have big implications on your revenue and cash flow in the near term, and what that looks like relative to the covenants and the financial sort of constraints that you're operating against in that world, and that with debt on the business. So, it's a matter of, okay, well, how do you incentivize your sales teams to sell the subscription offering versus the perpetual license offering? How do you structure the way they get compensated such that you don't move too fast and you don't move too slow? Now, we also had some, banks that understood that was the transition we were going through. And we were able to have conversations about the impact of going faster than we had originally planned to, and what that does to the numbers, but that it sort of returns in the next year or two after, as the sort of subscription revenue starts to compound. So understanding, sort of a group of banks to work with as we went through that transition. But it did require a lot of communication. It required a lot of ability to show what the numbers would have looked like if we'd paced differently or paced more aggressively. So there's just an enormous amount of financial modeling that went into it to be able to illustrate, what things would have been had they not paced as we were pacing that transition, to be able to illustrate the financial impact with and without those changes.
What do you learn from that experience that you're carrying to Intercom?
A bit of it is, just kind of going in with first principles mindset about how you measure success, like what metrics you use to measure how the business is performing. Learn a lot about seller compensation and how you balance driving behaviors for sort of the strategic change that you're trying to drive, but also reward them for just the fundamental growth in the business that they're driving. There's an enormous effort that goes into the systems infrastructure behind the scenes to make sure you can see what you need to see, relative to those new metrics that you're trying to drive the business on. So just a lot goes into the change associated with all of that.
Sales comp is let's just pick on that for a minute, because I guess it's materially different when you get compensated on a perpetual versus a recurrent. What was the hardest thing in sales comp as you move from one to the other?
Yeah. I'd say it was finding the balance between how do we structure that comp in order to drive the transition at the pace we wanted to. In other words, we knew we needed to incentivize sellers to sell the subscription software as distinct from the perpetual license. So practically speaking, what that meant is we had to put multipliers on the quota retirement associated with the annual contract value of the subscription in order to make it more attractive than the quota retirement they may get from a perpetual license deal.
Oh, interesting. But that affects margins now.
It absolutely does.
So now you're back to square one. So what are you doing there?
Yeah. So it's essentially you're paying for the long-term value, the lifetime value of that customer, as opposed to the upfront value of that customer. So you have to kind of understand the economics of, all right, when do you sort of break even on the revenue and cash flow associated with the subscription relative to what you had with the perpetual license. So those were kind of some of the things that guided our thinking about, all right, what multiplier should we put on this so that as a baseline, they're sort of equivalent from a lifetime value perspective, and thus the investment we're putting against them being equivalent pays off. It just takes a little longer.
But wait, is it equivalent or better?
Well, ultimately, we wanted to put a multiplier on it such that it was better for the seller to sell the subscription. But yes, ultimately, the lifetime value of the subscription you want to be better, like the way you price it and package it and so forth. You want it to be better. Otherwise, you wouldn't make the transition. But it was that kind of relationship. Like, what's the point at which those things break even on a revenue and cash flow basis, to think about how you put a multiplier on it to make them equivalent from a value perspective, and then you can decide how you incentivize sellers based on that multiplier.
Do you have to pitch this in front of the sales team and say like, "Hey guys, I got a plan for you, and you got to make a lot of money on this plan," and boom, you lay it.
And it started with, why are we doing this? Right? Because, it is a pretty significant transition, and it's a different conversation that they're having with the customer. And, they've got to be able to articulate the value difference to the customer. And, it's the strategic transition, the sort of value creation argument is where I started. Hey, this is really about increasing the value of the company over time as we make this transition. And this is why companies on subscription and recurring revenue pricing models are more valuable than perpetual license companies.
What was the diffing multiple on the EBITDA or whatever, you're judging valuation? Is it
probably get like at least 2 or 3 more turns on revenue for the subscription business?
That is massive. So the unlock was totally worth it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, the investment thesis was very clear for the private equity buyers that were helping lead us through this transition. So anyway, and then for the sellers, when you get into the compensation model itself, like, simplicity is key, right? That's the most important thing in my experience with all this.
If you need to pull out a spreadsheet to figure out your comp, you're already behind.
You already lost. And so I had a really good partner on the go-to-market side to help think through how we design it in a way that drives the incentives to sell the subscription deals over the perpetual deals, and do it in a way that's as simple as possible.
That's amazing. All right. So now you landed on Intercom. It's 2020, I think, right?
Yeah. First half of 2020. That's right.
It's probably the worst time to switch job. But here you are.
Here I am. I oddly, I remember, I think we we landed on the sort of offer, and I accepted on the offer, I think in February of 2020. And my start date was in April, just so that I could transition things at Sitecore. And between those dates, like the world turned upside down. I mean, everything shut down. Everybody was working from home. So for at least the first year at Intercom, I didn't meet anybody in person, that I hadn't met in the interview process. So it was a strange time, to be sure.
That's amazing. Okay, so now you take the job. It's 2020. Couple years in, you get a switcheroo in the CEO. SaaS hits a wall in general. Like, what's going through your head? What's going on? What are the plans? What's Dan doing?
Yeah, I mean, it was, like everybody in the early days of COVID, we saw all the tailwinds that technology companies were seeing: digital transformation, all the things.
Yeah, everybody was buying one of each. Money was raining from the sky, very literally.
That's right. Valuations were off the chart. Yeah, things were good. Things were looking up. And then, like everybody, first half of 2022, we started to see pressure on growth. And like most people, it was, not necessarily a new business growth, but it was in how customers were expanding or not expanding their use, given they bought so much during this sort of tailwinds period.
So do you have the problem of overbuying of seats or compression of seats because of layoffs, or both?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, during the sort of 2021 period, folks are expanding substantially and really envisioning like big growth in their teams. And as growth wasn't materializing in their teams coming out of that, were just the expansion needs that they had just were less significant, or they were growing into what they had purchased. And so our founder CEO returned, I think, in Q3 of 2022, Owen. And, as part of his return, really brought a focus on the customer service category specifically, as we historically sold to multiple different buyers for different use cases.
So wait, was that a pivot? Because you guys were like the front door of the web, right? Like that was the initial thesis. So there was this chatbot with all these things that were happening, and support was added on, because I was a user of Intercom in the early days. Support was sort of like added on as a thing that when people come in and they had a support ticket, that was one of the ways to route.
Yeah.
Was that a pivot to go heavy into support? Or was that already there? And it was 95% of the business, so it wasn't really a pivot.
Yeah, I mean, the majority of the business was in support, and it was sort of the strongest performing part of the business. Pivot in the sense that it was very much more focused from a use case, so a product perspective and a go-to-market perspective. Who's our buyer?
So you stopped selling to marketing and you've just focused on support.
Yeah, that's it.
Got it.
And sort of serendipitously, just a few months after that, the first iteration of these really transformative LLM tools came out. GPT 3.5 came out, I think, late November of 22. And we'd already had an AI team and a strong team, albeit quite small at the time, working on sort of the previous generations of AI in their application to customer service. And that team very quickly started to evaluate this technology, and I think within a couple of days had emailed Owen and his co-founder Des to essentially say, look, this is different this time. Like, I know these new technologies come out every now and then, but I think it's ready now. And they got together and very quickly realized this was different, and it was going to transform customer service. And with that, really bet a lot of resources on starting to build an AI agent for customer service. And you kind of get there. Like, if you fundamentally buy that this technology is going to transform customer service, if you don't do it yourself, somebody else is going to transform you out of business. So it was very quickly obvious.
So was there investment decisions that you have to make where the core team came to say to you and say, look, we need another $10 million in R&D to see this through? Or we're just revectoring?
In the early days, it was a lot about resource allocation. I mean, you have a lot of skilled engineers and product folks in the R&D organization, and it's about how you allocate those resources. Certainly, it became clear we needed to start investing in building the machine learning and AI team more quickly. And, allocation of new investment started to weigh more heavily towards that part of the team.
But as a cash conscious CFO, do you deallocate somewhere else? Like, do you revector people? Do you let some people go? Like, what's the mathing there?
Mostly an allocation of resources among existing folks and the teams, but then as we, are a growing business, had cash to invest in additional resources, those more heavily weighted towards the Fin AI agent product that we ended up releasing a few months after that GPT 3.5 launch. And then as we built conviction more and more that this was the future, just more and more resource allocation started to move towards that product functionality. We didn't leave the kind of core product functionality behind. We still have teams focused on that. And ultimately the ability for the AI agent and the help desk software that's facilitating the human work to integrate seamlessly matters a lot. But more and more resources focused on the AI agent technology over time.
So it feels like there is two core builds, right? Like one is the AI agent technology that clearly is going to, overtake the human component. But now you have an orchestration problem too, because you have the seats, you have the agent, and the orchestration in between. You have to build it to make sure that the whole thing works out, right?
Absolutely. And I'm going to be out of my depth here pretty quickly, but we already had the inbox functionality, the ticketing functionality, and the help desk solution that as conversations came in, whether they were conversations over email or the chat, which we're most known for, the messenger or WhatsApp or whatever channel it's coming through, it comes into that inbox. And then we have that messenger interface that's so strong, it just became clear, we're building Fin into that messenger interface. And then it was pretty straightforward to say anything that Fin didn't automatically resolve would then move into the inbox that the human is working in, with the context of the conversation that took place through the agent. So it very much naturally was kind of a seamless experience because of the messenger interface we were already sophisticated with, and the inbox and ticket functionality as well.
All right, so now you have this new functionality. This new functionality has a variable cost. You charge per seat. The new functionality has nothing to do with seats. What's going through your head? How are you going to make money?
As we were getting into how we monetize, how we price this thing, one of the first kind of realizations that hit us was, look, this is not monetizing the facilitation of human work, right? You think about why seats make sense. You're building workflows and automation for or facilitation of the work that humans are doing and making them more efficient with these AI tools, and particularly AI agents for customer service.
With a nice recurrent revenue stream that repeats as humans take seats and the whole thing works out, right?
Like with the SaaS margins you'd imagine it has, and
80%, we're good to go.
And then you look at these AI tools, and particularly for the customer service use case, where it's doing the actual work itself. It is answering customer queries, resolving problems automatically. And so it's not like it's assisting the work of the human, it's doing the work itself. And ultimately became pretty clear that like a seats-based model wasn't going to make sense for this. We didn't want to get into a world of like LLM usage plus a markup, because ultimately the customer is going to realize value not based on how much the LLM is used necessarily. So we started steering very clearly towards an outcome-based model, or very much a value-based model. We considered, conversation volume. If you think about a customer support team, the volume of what drives work is the volume of conversations that they have.
That's how BPOs charge, right? The conversation volume.
And again, that sort of puts the incentives at odds between, Intercom and our customers, right? Where, it's in the customer's interest that resolution rate, like the percentage of conversations that are resolved, is higher and higher. if they're just paying on conversations. But for Intercom, like, of course, we spend more for every resolution we deliver, and it just kind of put incentives at odds.
Plus, you want more resolutions to go to Intercom as opposed to fewer, right? So like if you're charging per interaction, then people gonna have to think about that.
That's right. That's right. I mean, it's if you think about it, I think back to my ad tech days. It's kind of the where you put the risk is, whether it's cost per click, cost per conversion, whatever it is, like your risk is passing from one side to the other depending on the model you choose. With this FinAI agent, it became pretty clear that an outcome-based model made the most sense. And so we came out with pricing monetizing on resolutions. We only charge you if we are resolving the conversation and essentially doing the work for you. Which is really a very clear thing for customers to look at and see value from. And a benefit of being in the customer service world is that it's very measurable. And I think that's a challenge that a lot of companies with AI capabilities in their products have is that for Intercom and for customer service, it's very measurable. It's a binary thing. Was it automatically resolved or was it not?
Interesting. Let's pause here for a minute. So give me a sense of the room where the decision is made. So you have yourself, you have Owen, you have a few product guys, you have probably people from your team. Like, is this a unanimous, like, yeah, let's go. This is the way, or is there a bunch of hesitation? I'm like, oh my God, will the customer accept that? Will we be able to make money? Like, is there edge cases that we haven't thought through? Like, you see what I mean? Like how there's a lot of companies who literally tell me, I'm not there yet on outcome-based pricing. And I'm like, are you not there yet? Or you never deliver outcomes and that's really what's making you hesitant of doing that? So like, walk me through how you get over the hurdles of people being like, I'm not really sure if it's going to work.
I mean, internally, we've got a pricing and packaging team who's responsible for kind of coming up with ideas and proposals and facilitating like the decision-making on all this. They did some research with customers, talked to real customers who were sort of open-minded to this technology and how they think about it. And, ultimately sort of anchored on the principle that connecting the way we monetize to the way customers realize value from the product was fundamentally a principle we wanted to stick to. And so it felt, I'm not going to say it didn't feel uncomfortable or scary or any of those things, right? It was brand new at the time. I think we were the first company to be in market with an outcome-based pricing model, for LLM functionality.
Is that right? Were you guys the first?
I think we were. I'm not aware of anybody else who had something in market before us. I've not actually gone and audited all, but I'm pretty confident we were first in market. Yeah.
That's amazing. That's, they say, pioneers are the ones with arrows on their back. So what gave you the comfort of just stepping out of everybody's comfort zone and just claiming that outcome-based pricing as your new go-to-market?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like it is fundamentally the principle that we want to connect the way we monetize, the way we earn money to the value we're delivering to customers. That like fundamentally was the thing that guided us on that. And you say what gave us comfort? Like it was uncomfortable. It was scary, because you don't know how it's going to play out. This is all brand new, but more and more as we talk to companies, we saw it resonating. We saw the response as, hey, this makes sense. This feels fair. And the ROI story is an obvious one too. If you think about it from a customer's perspective, as I described before, like this technology is doing the work that would otherwise be done by people on their teams. Because it's so measurable from a resolution count perspective, it's very easy to calculate, okay, what am I going to realize from deploying this functionality? If I'm able to automatically resolve, at the time when we first launched it was about 25% resolution rate. We're now well north of like the mid 60s. It's just an obvious, like, okay, this makes sense. I'm going to pay this much for these resolutions. I'm going to deflect this much work that would otherwise be coming to my team. And it gives them the chance to make a decision at that point of, okay, do I free up those resources to go focus on other value-added activities, whether that's focus on high-value accounts for a more personal touch or, deploying those resources to more customer success, cross-sell, upsell type activities, or driving usage or whatever it might be, or to repurpose the investment altogether.
I got so many questions for this. Let me order my thinkings here. So you actually went to customers and propose this new model. What was it? So the feedback was, it's fair, et cetera. Like, give me more depth of flavor of how those customer conversations went, and what gave you true, like, you had a little bit of conviction, now you have real conviction because you actually went, knowing the tape, right? That you actually went to market with it. But what was the thing the customer said that got everybody together? I mean, like, F yeah, let's go.
It wasn't as that, like, we didn't go to customers and say, do you like this one thing? We said, all right, here's the range of pricing models for this technology. Should it be seats? Should it be conversation volume? Should it be resolutions? And you have a conversation about each one. Now, I wasn't personally in these customer calls, but saw a lot of the content that came out of it. It was very clear that seats didn't make sense. That makes sense for kind of a co-pilot product, or an agent assistant product. Where you're sort of trying to improve the efficiency or the productivity of the person doing the work with the agent. And then between a conversation volume measure and a resolutions-based measure, it wasn't, I'd say unanimous, because, a customer might perceive a monetization model on just conversation volume to be more predictable, particularly in the early days of these agents where they don't know what kind of resolution rate they're going to get, and they don't know how much consumption they're going to have. But they do have a pretty good sense of what's their total conversation volume coming in because they pay so much attention to it for their resources.
And all the vendors are charging that way, and the BPOs are charging that way. So like the entire industry is already set up around this thing. So you have to break the mold to actually even get there.
That's right. And so the biggest objection or the biggest anxiety that we heard about, I don't know, this is too unpredictable. I don't know what I'm going to have to spend on this. But they also didn't know how effective it was going to be. And they weren't going to want to pay for it if it wasn't going to be effective. And so that ultimately led them, the majority of them at least, and us to, we only get paid if you're realizing value. And, it wasn't unanimous amongst the customers that we spoke to, but it did become clear that it resonated more so than the kind of conversation-based metric because it was so much more connected to value.
So one thing is to talk to a CEO or a CFO, because you guys are high up here. What's the conversation with procurement like? So now the procurement person is getting this contract that doesn't look like anything else. It's like, I don't even know what to make of this. You know what I mean? Like, and I'm sure there's a controller in there that is observing risk and trying to figure out like which end is up. And like, you got this new type of contract that's based on resolution and everything this thing is for. How you get them comfort that things are going to be okay?
I mean, we offered a lot of flexibility in the way customers could buy. So, if a customer, especially in the early days of these technologies, there's a lot of memes in the universe about hallucinations from these technologies. And, if you're asking a customer to bet on this thing talking to their customers, those things are really scary.
And there's nothing but bad news out there in the press, right? Like the bot that gave a Ford 150 for free, right? Like there is.
Yeah. So there's plenty of that out in everybody's minds, and customer service leaders, rightfully so, care a lot about the experience that they're delivering for their customers. So in the early days, it was, the early adopters and the pioneers who were exploring this thing, like, I'm not sure if I trust it yet, but I'm going to try it. And so we offered, pay-go pricing models. So there was no commitment.
Oh, interesting. So you went there. How does that make you feel as a CFO of a subscription-based company? Now you go and pay-go.
Once you sort of decide that an outcome-based model is the answer, it's a consumption model, it's a usage model.
Burn the ships and you use Move England.
It is. It's like you're going for it, and you just kind of accept it and make it work. But yeah, the pay-go option was at least a way for customers to try it out in a small way and build confidence in it, and then grow their usage over time as they built that confidence. And then, of course, the product continued and still continues to get better and better and better in the experience it drives for customers, in the rate at which it resolves conversations automatically, the the complexity of conversations that it can resolve automatically. And so as customers saw that value, they saw that the experience it was delivering to their customers was high quality, and even in some ways higher quality than the experience that the humans were able to deliver, because often customer service teams are resource strapped, and there are wait times. You might have a first response time target of 2 hours, and for their customer, getting an instantaneous response that's on 24/7 and is delivering high quality responses, like it just became quickly obvious that it was a game changer for them. And so as customers got used to it and built that confidence and conviction, then they're more comfortable saying, all right, I'd like to commit to a contract for 100,000 resolutions a month for a year.
Yeah. How long did it take for customers to build conviction?
I'd say at least 3 months for a lot of customers. It's not that long. No, it's pretty clear, pretty fast, like how well this thing works. And for some customers, it was as part of a proof of concept, even before they committed anything. And then so, more and more customers were willing to make those commitments. And now, I mean, we're 2.5 years in, 3 years in, and this is the norm. Like if you're not using an AI agent for your customer service, you're behind at this point. And so going into it, customers are coming into it more with a mindset of, okay, we're transforming the way we operate. We're not just dipping our toe in the water.
So what benefit would you say it brought you to be the first one to step out of line and create a new pricing model that aligns to your customer benefits, is outcome-based, only pay when you deliver the work, versus, I know you cannot, it's hard for you to imagine a counterfactual, but like, how much would it say give you advantage by being the first versus just sticking to the model and trying to fight it out in the good fight and the way that everybody else is fighting?
Look, we were the first AI agent for customer service on the market. So in the beginning, there wasn't anybody else doing anything. I mean, it was probably a year before anybody else was in market with an AI agent with any pricing model, much less an outcome-based model. So we had a lot of runway in that sense because we were so early to market with the product itself. And I would argue that in some ways, those that followed benefited from the ground we broke and the credibility we built for outcome-based pricing, and so had some evidence to base their own decisions on for what pricing model might make sense. And generally, just being first in the market with these AI agents for customer service and an outcome-based pricing model, Intercom's always, I think, had a great reputation for innovation. And this, just helped to support that reputation and build on it.
Well, not pricing innovation technology.
No, not necessarily pricing innovation, but certainly for technology innovation. And this helped us build some credibility on the pricing side. In fact, in the past, our pricing models have been kind of all over the place, even prior to my tenure at Intercom, and not popularly so among customers. We made some mistakes in the past on how we priced and packaged our technology, in part for the complexity of the offerings that we had in market.
So is it true that the first thing that Owen did when he came back is simplify pricing into something?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that was one of the very early focuses on like the short list of priorities that he brought with him when he rejoined, was fixing pricing and packaging.
Interesting. That
was a part of the principles behind landing on a simple outcome-based 99 cents a resolution. It's simple, it's easy to understand. And it fit alongside the great simplification that we were building into the sort of help desk pricing model as well.
So let's break that down. So 99 cents, what went into the 99 cents? How do you arrive at that number? Why 99 cents? What, not $1.02, not $1.985?
Yeah, you got to look at it, at least we looked at it a number of different ways. So obviously margin comes into it. Now, in the early days of these things, margin might be one thing, but the technology is changing so fast, you kind of have to make guesses about where that's going to evolve to. We wanted, it's not like there were other products in the market that we could compare to and decide how competitive we would be.
That's a blessing of being first. You got
that. Yeah. That's so that
you're only working on principle. There's nothing else there.
That's exactly right. And then we of course thought about, okay, what value are we delivering to our customers through automated resolutions? And you think about that in terms of, okay, what's the average cost per ticket for a customer using human resources, whether they're based in the US or offshored or BPOs? It's a pretty wide range. And so we considered that, because ultimately that's, if you can imagine from a customer perspective how they're going to evaluate ROI. And then we also thought about the fact that we were first to market, and that the conviction we had that this was the way customer service was going to be done, and that a greater and greater percentage of conversation volume was going to be automated responses handled by AI over time. We didn't then, and we don't believe now, that humans in this customer service experience are going anywhere anytime soon. But it was obvious that the agents were going to start to do a greater and greater percentage of those conversations. And with that in mind, wanted to just remove barriers that customers might have to trying it, to just dipping their toe in the water. You already had the kind of FUD in the world about these LLMs and what they are and aren't capable of, and errors they make. So, we had to make it simple for customers to just be willing to give it a shot, try it out. So that was part of the reason for pay-go pricing offering. It's part of the reason for offering a relatively low price, 99 cents, relative to the value that a customer realizes out of it. And in part, we were trying to establish a foothold, a beachhead in the market. We knew we were first, and wanted to take advantage of that by driving as much growth and adoption of it as possible.
This sounds great, because you're a CFO and you're, above the clouds, a little ivory tower. Take me through, what does it mean? All these changes, all these complexities, all this unlearning from the past, to your sales team, to your support team, to your sales engineers, to your post-sales engineers, to success organization. This is, you guys are not small anymore. So these changes are fundamental to the way in which your customer-facing team communicates to your customers. How did that work? What were the strategies that succeeded, and what failed as part of this change?
Among our customer support team itself, like it was very quickly a, choose your cliche, but drink your own champagne, eat your own dog food, whatever it is. Right? It was like, you got to be a model for how this should be done.
I even didn't think about that. Like, you guys are bearing the brunt of this thing, and then you got to show up, aging like.
You got to act like it. So we have a wonderful customer service leader in Declan, who grabbed onto this early and really ran with it. And our own team's adoption of Fin, has been a great partner to our product and R&D organization for continuing to build the capabilities of Fin. Because it's not just about how the agent performs, it's how you put product around it so that the people running the customer service team and can give guidance to the agent, can provide knowledge to it, can tell it what it can and can't do. And, obviously customers care a lot about that stuff. So there's a lot of product around it as well. And then, as you think, you asked about sales and sales engineers and so forth, obviously a lot of enablement that goes into it. Enablement, like, what is this technology? What does it do? How does it work? Enablement about, like, how do you address the natural anxieties that are out there about using these technologies to talk to customers? How do you tell the story of ROI and value? And it's obvious to someone like me, and hopefully obvious to a lot of folks, but it's a different conversation than an ROI conversation about your help desk and the seats that you're monetizing on. And then you have to think about the fact that, a lot of companies in the early days were just trying it out at very small levels of commitment. And for your seller, who is paid on like bookings and what quota they can require, are they going to spend time on this thing that they might get a little bit of booking for, versus the help desk, for which they know how to sell it, they know what the product is, they can get a good deal out of it. And so we had to make it we had to make it obvious for them to invest time in this. So things like incentivizing sellers based on the number of logos, not even the size of the revenue commit that they get out of a deal.
Was that a spiff or was that a bounty? What?
It could have been a spiff. Or essentially a bounty, like a percentage of compensation was tied to logos who adopted Fin or who purchased Fin. So if 70% of a customer's or a rep's commission is on quota retirement bookings, and 30% or 40%, whatever number you choose, is a function of the number of logos they sell Fin to, we'd had like a minimum deal size on it, but they were tiny.
So was there a logo quota then?
Essentially a logo quota. Yeah, exactly that. Which from a CFO perspective is scary.
Yeah, heart stopping.
The hard stuff. I mean, but again, if you're coming at it from the perspective of this transformation is happening, whether we're the ones driving it or not, you have to choose to be the one driving the transformation. Because if you don't, somebody else is going to do it and tear your business apart.
You just said it has to, there's like at least 5 CFOs that I know that are going to take this and take some notes. That you may get some calls next week. So I apologize for your phone blowing up because this is just gold. All right, so let's in the next 5 minutes, let's talk about the future. Okay, so Fin is launched, crushing it on the information retrieval side. Doing really good on the deflection side. You guys are first in the market. That you guided the market. You're now the shepherd of the market when it comes to resolutions and how you monetize this. Now you launch this sort of next initiative, which is, Fin gets smart, right? Agents don't get dumber, they get smarter. Fin is resolving all these issues, but it's costing you a lot more to resolve these issues. How are you thinking about that? How's the organization moving along with you? And what is, I know we're not there yet, but what will be the steps that follow after this?
Yeah. I mean, in the early days when we launched Fin, we were getting 25% resolution rates, as I mentioned, and those have grown very steadily over time to now north or probably close to 70% today. As you can imagine, as that resolution rate improves, and that's really been the North Star for how we think about the success of Fin in its delivery of value for customers, is what percentage of conversations can it resolve. So, but fundamentally, the more it's resolving, the better for our margin profile. Merely for the fact that it's not spending time on compute for things it didn't resolve, and thus we're not monetizing. So the greater the resolution rate, the better it is for margins and obviously revenue and profit. So that's a fundamental mathematical truth in the economics of this model. The next is, you want to continue to handle more and more advanced conversations. And as you alluded to, the more complex those conversations that the tool is able to resolve, the more sort of LLM usage associated with it. Now, that's not universally true, but as a heuristic, I think it's a fair assumption. Now, at the same time, the LLMs that are underneath all this, there's price pressure among them. There's a lot of competition there. There's the latest and greatest models that come out, and it's not that we just use one model underneath. There's probably over a dozen of them for the various parts of the conversation that Fin is handling. And, you want to choose the model for each part of that conversation that is optimal to the performance of that part of the conversation. And that may not be the most expensive, sophisticated LLM out there. Or, you don't need a Ferrari for, to drive to the grocery store. So, we're able to choose the model that's optimized for the particular part of the conversation. And then the most complex parts, obviously, you want to use the most sophisticated model on the market. And then, that's another way that you can kind of manage margins as part of the whole profile. But there is, and this is a conversation I have with R&D leaders all the time, just a natural tension between the improving performance of the model as driven by the increased use of the LLMs or the sophistication of our use of the LLMs and margin. And conversations we have all the time now.
And just to call you out on something that you said earlier, is that the more it costs you to solve a problem, the more valuable that problem is probably. And it's not, growing at the same rate of your cost. It's probably growing at an exponential rate of cost, meaning tracking somebody's package and telling you whether a package is going to be late or not, or letting them know whether something is in warranty or not, it's probably a pretty expensive resolution, but it's such a valuable resolution, especially if it's deflected from a human. So you're back to square one of like the discrepancy between value delivered and cost.
But you can imagine they're correlated, right? In other words,
100%.
Yeah, the compute underneath to automatically resolve the conversation is, generally speaking, correlated to the human time saved. So the compute associated with a 30-second conversation that a human would have handled is typically quite a bit less than that for a 10-minute conversation that a human would have handled, or a 20-minute conversation.
Close that up. What happens to the 99 cents then, if as you get smarter?
Like, we're focused on keeping pricing simple and continuing to deliver value for customers. So we have not chosen to differentially monetize at a higher rate for a more complex conversation. You can imagine the complexity that introduces. Now, that's not to say that we never would. There may be reasons in the future that we might choose to do so. But you've got to imagine that conversation with the customer. What do you mean by a more complex conversation? What counts as a more complex conversation versus an easy conversation? And how do you tell the difference? And, in the spirit of the simplicity that we were trying to start from, it's sort of at odds with that. So over time, there will be a tension here. As we get into other use cases, we contemplate, the use of Fin for other parts of the customer journey. That potentially introduces additional complexity. So there's very much a tension between all of these things. And thus far, we've chosen to continue to prioritize simplicity, to just kind of minimize the barriers to how customers think about and realize value.
That's amazing. So I love the fact that the principle is the beginning of the conversation. This is what happens. You inventing new markets, right? You don't have precedent, you don't have comparisons, so you're on your own. To close it up, how would you say the market has changed because of what Intercom has done?
I mean, companies are thinking differently about how AI can do real work. It's certainly convenient for us that customer service is such an obvious use case for the application of these technologies. But I think it started to open people's minds to, okay, how do I think about what value I can get out of technologies using AI? How do I measure that value? I talk to vendors who are building products for the finance space, software for finance. And, one of the first things I talk about with them is, how am I realizing value from this relative to what I'm using today? How does that show up? Whether in the form of time saved or roles eliminated or productivity gains or whatever it might be. And perhaps more importantly, how do I measure that? And thus far, at least in the finance category, there's not a lot of products out there that are doing enough to up level or to order of magnitude change productivity. But I think it'll come over time. And so I think more and more companies are trying to both design monetization models themselves and be able to communicate about the value they're delivering with the AI that they're building into their products is more and more the focus. And I think Intercom started that with starting from a value-based, outcome-based pricing model. And that's harder to do in some use cases, at least it is today. But I think we sort of set that as the foundation for how it should work.
I love that, and this is a great point to break. I am, first of all, thankful to you for jumping on this and breaking it down for everyone who's trying to figure out how you guys did it. Second of all, thankful to you and Intercom for beginning the whole movement towards outcome-based pricing. As you know, paid was built on the premise that agents deliver different work, and that you can't just charge the way software was charged, because the work that they're delivering is worth a lot more, and you're leaving money on the table. And if you didn't have a pioneer like you, I will be hard pressed to find a good example. So I appreciate what you guys have done for the market. I know it's hard, but with people like you leading it, I can take comfort that this is going to go in the right direction. So thanks again, Dan, and thank you for being here in the Get Paid podcast.
My pleasure, Manny. Great to be with you here. Thanks for the chat.
If you like the podcast, click like or subscribe. We are on the Apple podcast platform. We're on the Spotify platform. We're on the YouTube platform. We are on all major platforms. We're always fresh. Every week it comes out. Let's get paid.